Hi, I'm Tim Ellis, and I'm here to show you how to build an inexpensive retro gaming machine in under an hour. You may have heard of the Raspberry Pi. That is, of course, what we will be using. But before we get into that, real quick introduction. Who am I? I am at the Tim on Twitter. I've been gaming since sometime in the 1980s, originally on Atari, Commodore 64, NES. I also write about video games for the local Seattle tech news site GeekWire. And I have a podcast called Dispatches from the Multiverse, where we do improvised comedy on all kinds of different parallel dimensions. And I'm also a dog owner. That's an important note. Let's go over what you're going to need. You're going to need a Raspberry Pi. There are a bunch of different versions of Raspberry Pi. What I have here is the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus. This is not the most recent version. There is now the Raspberry Pi 4 that's available, which is the most recent version if you go to buy one today. I believe Raspberry Pi 2, 3, even the original Raspberry Pi will probably work. It's just a matter of which games you're going to be able to run on them. The more new the Raspberry Pi is, the more powerful it is, the more games you're going to be able to run on it, such as Nintendo 64 and that kind of stuff. Anything with Raspberry Pi 3 and up have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which does allow you to use Bluetooth controllers. There's a little extra configuration for that, and I'm not going to go into that today. That's a little bit more advanced. I'm just going to stick with the plug-in USB controllers, but it is an option if you have the Raspberry Pi 3 or 4. And same with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is potentially useful for getting ROMs onto your device and things like that. You can also technically install RetroPie on as small as a 4 gigabyte SD card, which is the second thing you're going to need, micro SD card. You're probably going to want something bigger than a 4 gigabyte though. What I'm using here is a 32 gigabyte. You can use even larger than that. It's mostly a matter of how much room do you want for your ROMs. The system itself, the RetroPie system, only needs about 4 gigabytes to be able to run, but you are going to want a bigger card to fit lots of ROMs on there. Most people load it up with ROMs. You're going to need a 2 amp USB power supply and a micro USB cable, which I do not have sitting here in front of me, but you know what a micro USB cable looks like. It's important to note that it does need to be a 2 amp power supply. If you try to undersupply this with one of the more cheap USB power supplies, it's going to complain at you and have problems and not run properly. So make sure you get one that's rated for the Raspberry Pi at least 2 amps. You're going to need an HDMI cable because that is the main interface. You can see here on the side of the board, we've got our HDMI out. Obviously your TV or monitor of choice, and almost any USB game controller. Again, as I mentioned, you can use Bluetooth with the newer versions. What I'm going to be using here is a modern replica of the 6-button Sega controller that's USB. So it plugs in real conveniently into a PC or the Raspberry Pi. The last thing that is potentially useful for you to have in your setup process only is a USB keyboard, like that. And that allows you to go through some of the Wi-Fi configurations and things like that, which you can't exactly do easily with a gamepad. I'm not going to necessarily step through every little bit of that today, but just know that having a USB keyboard that you can plug in temporarily just for the setup process is a handy thing. Let's talk quickly about where to get your Raspberry Pi. So you can go on Amazon. I don't recommend that. Most of what you're going to find on Amazon are bundles and things like that include a whole bunch of stuff you don't really need and are marked way up. If you go to raspberrypi.org, you can get a list of the legitimate retailers that have Raspberry Pi that are getting them direct from the manufacturer. And all of the legitimate retailers should be selling them for the sort of the standard version is going to be $35 plus tax and shipping. That is the 2 gigabyte model, the version that has 2 gigabytes of built-in memory. If you want the 4 gigabyte version, it should be no more than $55. If you want the 1 gigabyte version, that one is only $30. So if you see prices that are higher than that, don't pay them. Go to one of the legitimate retailers that's listed on the site and don't overpay for your Raspberry Pi because $35 is the most you should be paying, again, for the 2 gigabyte model. Let's talk briefly about accessories. So one of the accessories that I like, unfortunately they're getting a little harder to find now, but you can still pick them up, is vintage controller USB adapters. So, if you actually have an original NES controller lying around, and I'm not talking about the ones that came with the NES Mini that have the little like Wii connector on them. I'm talking about the original NES controller that has this little 5-sided shape on here. You can get an adapter that has that same thing on there. You can plug your original NES controller into the adapter, and then bam, it's USB. And that works right out off the shelf with the RETROPIE. And same thing, you can find the same thing for Super NES controllers, for your old school Sega Genesis controllers, all that kind of stuff. So I've got one here too for the Super NES. You can see it's got that funky wide 7-pin connector. Click it in there, and then now it's a USB controller. And it's the actual original Super NES controller, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, like I said, those are getting a little hard to find. It used to be you could pick them up for $10 to $20, get them on Amazon, or find them at Walmart even. Now they're harder to find, but they're still out there. The good brands, if you can find them, are Tomy and Mayflash. Those are the ones that make sort of the gold standard adapters, if you will. Let's also talk about cases. So I've got a couple of different case options. So, this one here is just sort of an off-the-shelf, I think I paid $10 to $15 for this one. It's a nice looking, sharp, simple rectangle case. Got aluminum on the sides. Got some anti-skid stuff on the bottom. Got a Raspberry Pi, an older version, I think, in here. There's also, you can get a fancy case that like actually looks like a Super Nintendo or, a Sega Genesis or things like that. You can get ones that have all kinds of fancy features like extra USB ports that are in the front so that your USB ports are not necessarily on the side, or have power lights or power switches or that kind of stuff. Lots of bells and whistles. You can spend a lot of money on a case if you want to, or you can spend as little as $5 for the official case, which is this simple red and white case that just kind of pops open real easily. You click the Raspberry Pi into there and you're off and running, and you've got it protected from dropping something on it or whatever. Before we get into it, let's go over the steps. I'm just going to run through this whole list, and then we're going to actually walk through it and do it. So the first step is you're going to download the RETROPIE software from the website. Then you're going to take that RETROPIE software and you're going to flash it to your micro SD card. The next step, once you've got the RETROPIE software flashed to the SD card, you're just going to plug in the SD card into your Raspberry Pi, and you're going to plug it into power and plug it into your TV, and it's going to do its initial boot up sequence. And the first thing it's going to do is going to ask you to set up your controllers. So you plug your controller in, and then you configure what all the buttons are. Then if you want to set up internet, which is not necessary, you don't need to be connected to the internet, but if you want to, you would set it up next. Then the next step is actually you go back to your computer, whether that's a Mac or a PC or whatever, and you take a USB stick. And again, there's other ways to do this, but I'm just going over the simplest, most straightforward way. But you take your USB stick and you set it up on the computer, you format it in the right way, set up a folder on there. Then you take your USB stick and you plug it into your Raspberry Pi, and it does some little magic. And then you take the USB stick out of the Raspberry Pi and you put it back to your computer, and then you load up as many ROMs as you've got, wherever you got them. I'm not going to ask. You don't need to tell me. You put the ROMs onto the USB stick. Once you got them all on there, you take it back out of your computer, stick it back into the Raspberry Pi. You wait for while it copies them all over. You restart the emulator program on the Raspberry Pi, and then everything's working. That's it. That's the whole thing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through every one of those steps basically in real time with you right now. So let's get going. The first step you're going to do is you're going to download the RETROPIE software. So this is totally free, and obviously the amount of time it's going to take depends on how fast your internet connection is. I'm not going to sit here and download the software in real time in front of you. That would not make for a very entertaining panel. So I've actually cheated and I've pre-downloaded the software. I'm just going to walk you through where to get that and how to do it. So retropie.org.uk, and this is what the website looks like right now. Obviously, it may look different if you're viewing this at some later date, but you go to retropie.org.uk and you click the little button on there that says Get RetroPie, and it'll download the package that you need, and that's it. It's a .tar.gz or something. The file extension it doesn't matter if you don't have an app that opens it, because we're going to show you in a few steps from now, the app that we use to burn it to the SD card actually just opens it exactly as it is downloaded. So don't unzip it or do anything like that once you've downloaded it. Just download the file and take a note of where it went on your computer, and you'll be fine. RetroPie emulates a ton of systems. You can see them all on the screen here right now. You've got your classics, of course, NES, SNES, Sega Master System or Genesis, Game Boy, GameCube. Now, once you're talking about things like GameCube and Dreamcast, that's when you're getting into the realm of games that may not emulate quite as well. I haven't tried them personally on a Raspberry Pi 4, but even then, you're getting into iffy territory there. Really, these Raspberry Pis do best with the older classic games like SNES and Sega Genesis and that kind of stuff. I recommend sticking to those for the most part, unless you want to deal with, errors and choppiness and stuff like that. You've got your file downloaded. It's taken a few minutes, whatever. You've noted where it is on your computer. So the next step is to copy that file to your SD card, which again, I'm not going to do in real time here because this is the longest and most boring step. So what I recommend is there's a website called Etcher.io. And Etcher.io has this free utility that lets you flash from the RetroPie image onto an SD card. Super simple, totally free. So you go and you download Etcher.io, you walk through the steps. So the first thing it's going to show you is you need to pick from file. So you click on that button and it's going to pop up a thing that tells you locate the file. Show me where it is that this file is at that you want me to burn. So this is where the file that you downloaded in step 1, you note where that was, and this is, you open that directory and you choose the file, and then you go to step 2. So the next step is select target. So that target just means your SD card. So your SD card at this point is in your computer, and you have plugged into your computer, and you should see a list on the screen when you say select target that has the thing that's your SD card. So you choose that. You make sure that the one you choose is the one that has like the right size. If you get a 32 gigabyte card in there, make sure the size that it shows is roughly 30 gigabytes or 128 gigabytes or whatever it is that you've stuck in there. Now, once you select that, you check the box and you hit select. And then the next thing, once you've done that, now you can see the first 2 boxes have what you've chosen in them. And then the next button is flash. So you click the flash button. Now, what might happen if you put in a card that is bigger than 32 or 64? I don't know exactly what the threshold is. I know that it does pop up when you try to do it to a 128 gigabyte card. Is you might get a warning that tells you, hey, wait a minute, like this drive is really big. Are you sure this is really an SD card? Just hit continue, assuming you have in fact selected the right drive and you haven't accidentally selected your, USB backup drive or something like that. Make sure you've selected the right SD card drive and click continue. And then what you're going to see is these screens here. So the first screen says flashing, and it's going to slowly climb from 0 to 100% on flashing. And then once it finishes flashing, it's going to do validating. It's going to slowly climb from 0 to 100% on validating. And then after it's done validating, then it's going to say finishing. And it just kind of sits there and finishing for a few seconds. It looks like it's not doing anything maybe. Leave it on there. Don't do anything yet. And then once it's actually finished, it'll pop up this last screen that says flash complete. And that's it. You're done. So now you can take the memory card out of your computer and stick it into the Raspberry Pi. So the slot on this one is right here on the bottom. And that's one thing that's nice about the Raspberry Pi is that for the most part, from version to version, they've kept the different plugs, things like where you slot in your SD card and where you plug in your Ethernet or your USB or your HDMI. They've stayed relatively in the same spot on the board, so they're all fairly the same. So this should look roughly the same as the Raspberry Pi 4. So you finish flashing your card, you've put it into your Raspberry Pi. So now you get to the part where you plug it in. So we are going to do this part live. So we're going to switch over now to the video feed on my Raspberry Pi. You've got your SD card plugged into your Raspberry Pi. What you're going to do is plug in the HDMI to your TV, and then once everything's hooked up, then plug in your power into the micro USB power port on the Raspberry Pi, and the little light should come on, and that indicates it is powering up. The first thing you're going to see when you plug in the Raspberry Pi for the first time is you're going to see a whole sequence of a whole bunch of different setup screens. It's going to show the little Raspberry Pi logo. It's going to show a whole bunch of text on the screen, and it's going to flash a whole bunch of things at you. You might briefly see like a rainbow image. You might see it'll go black for a second, and then it'll come back. It'll flash up the RetroPie logo like this, and in a second here, it's going to go back to the wall of text and initialize a whole bunch of more stuff. You don't really have to worry about any of this. Just, it doesn't matter to you what all this is saying. All that matters is that it gets to the end of this process, and Assuming you've done everything correctly and that nothing's wrong with your Raspberry Pi, it should eventually get to the end of this whole part of the process pretty easily, pretty painlessly. And what's going to happen when it gets done with this whole initial setup thing is it's going to ask you to configure the controller. So you also want to make sure that your controller is plugged in to the USB. And once it finishes the setup here, as you can see, it's still thinking. There's a few little drivers to initialize or checks to make on the hardware, whatever it is it's doing. But in a moment here, it's going to say starting emulation station, which is the underlying program that is running all of the RetroPie stuff. So here we go. Here's emulation station, and it says welcome. One gamepad detected. Hold the button on your device to configure it. Press F4 to quit. Okay, so I hold the button, and it said it detected my controller. So now it's asking me to do the gamepad configuration. So you just go down this list and you press what it tells you to press. So I up, down, left, right, select, start, A, B, X, Y, left button, left shoulder, right shoulder, left trigger, right trigger. Now, what's going to happen eventually if you're using like a retro controller like this Sega controller that I'm using is you're going to get to ones that don't have a button on your controller. And don't worry, just pick some button that you've already assigned, like A or down arrow or whatever, and just press and hold that. And what it'll do is it'll skip to the next one. So you press and hold, skips to the next one, then you let go, press and hold again, skips to the next one. You just keep doing that down the list on all the ones that you don't have on this controller. Get to hotkey enable, you want to press like select or something like that. That is one that you can double assign to a different thing. It's useful. It's the button that, like, if you hold that button down and press another button, there's different shortcuts basically that you can do. Once you've done all of that, then it's going to jump you out to the main screen. So you're at the main screen and it says RetroPie configuration. Okay, so the next step that you're going to do is you're going to take your USB stick, stick it into the RetroPie. It's useful if you have a USB stick that has a busy indicator light on it, because this part of the process is going to take a minute or two. It's kind of hard to know exactly how long it's going to take, but assuming you've configured it correctly, you stick it in there and the light's going to turn on and it's just going to sit there and flash. And as you can see on the screen here, while that's happening, it doesn't look like anything's going on. Like on your screen, there's no feedback whatsoever that anything is happening. But what's actually happening is the Raspberry Pi has detected your USB stick. It's detected that you put that RetroPie folder on there, and it's loading that RetroPie folder with all kinds of stuff. It's loading it with a directory structure that has all of your different games on it, the different folders for your different systems, your NAS folder, your SNES folder, your master drive folder. All those different things are going to be folders that it's creating right now. And it's also loading up a few other things that are important to be able to recognize this drive that you're using, this USB stick, as a device that is used for RetroPie. So you're just going to have to sit here and wait. And again, if you have an indicator light, you can see that it's flashing and blinking. And once it stops flashing, then you know it's done. But if you don't have an indicator light, then I would say wait at least 2 or 3 minutes to make sure that it's totally finished doing the whole setup process. Either way, once it's done, assuming the light stops flashing or you've just waited 2 or 3 minutes, then you should be able to safely unplug your USB stick from your RetroPie. And that's when you take it and you bring it back to the computer. You go back to your computer, you plug it into the computer, and you'll see if everything worked. You should see the directory structure where inside the RetroPie folder is your ROMs folder. And then in your ROMs folder is where you have different subfolders for NES, Super NES, all that kind of stuff. And that's where you drag the ROMs that you have into their respective folders. And of course, these are ROMs that you've legally obtained. It's a don't ask, don't tell type of situation here. You put them onto the USB stick into their appropriate folders. Once you've got all the ROMs on there that you want, what you're going to do is you're going to take that USB stick and bring it back to the RetroPie. You're going to plug it into your Raspberry Pi. And what's going to happen there is it's going to blink again. And at this point, what it's doing is it's actually copying all those ROMs that you loaded onto the USB stick onto the system itself. So this is where you need to make sure that you haven't loaded your USB stick with more content than what you actually have available on the size of memory card that you use. So if you're using like a 16 gigabyte USB stick and you somehow come up with 16 gigabytes of ROMs, but your SD card that you use for this whole thing is only 8 gigabytes, so you're going to run into trouble. While we're waiting for the USB stick to stop flashing while it's setting up the folders there, I wanted to share a fun little bit of video game trivia. So this here is an Atari Missile Command trackball from the original arcade cabinet from the 1980s. What you may not know about the trackball from the original arcade cabinets is that they weren't really trackballs. I mean, they are trackballs, but Atari, when they were designing these cabinets, they were looking for, somebody to supply a ball that had the right amount of weight and was the right size. It would fit, nestled into that control panel and had the, that good heavy feel. And what they found was something called a candlepin bowling ball. And candlepin bowling is a bowling style that is popular on the East Coast, not so much over here on the West Coast. I'd never heard of it until I learned this bit of trivia. But in candlepin bowling, they use a ball exactly this size with no holes for the fingers, and the pins are just straight cylinders. They don't have the taper that a typical bowling pin has. But Atari figured out that these candlepin bowling balls were the size that they wanted to use, and so they went to a candlepin bowling manufacturer and said, hey, can we get, like 10,000 or 100,000 of these things? And this guy said, yes, you absolutely can. And that's a way bigger order than we've ever had for our actual bowling balls. So guess what? We are no longer a bowling ball manufacturer. We are now an Atari trackball manufacturer. And of course, they didn't actually change anything at all about what they were manufacturing. They just changed what they were calling it. They continued making the exact same stuff. In fact, if you have an arcade cabinet with a bad trackball, it's all scratched up or cracked or something like that, you can literally go out today and just buy a candlepin bowling ball that's the same diameter, and it'll be a drop-in replacement because it's still a thing that exists, and it's just a fun little bit of video game trivia. So once you've done that and it's dumped all that stuff on there, that's when you restart Emulation Station. So that's what we just did here. It doesn't actually reboot the whole thing. It just restarts Emulation Station, and then boom, you can see, here we go. Everything worked. It copied over the ROMs, and now we have new options on our main menu. Instead of just RetroPie, we have Nintendo. We have Sega Master Drive, which is Sega Genesis here in the US. We have Nintendo 64. We have Super Nintendo. And you scroll left and right and choose one of those with the A button, and you can see all the ROMs that you uploaded. So we're going to launch Sonic here. Give it a try. It's going to take a second to initialize the whole thing. This is the first time we've done it. And here we go. Love that Sega jingle. Sonic Team presents. So you know the drill. It's Sonic the Hedgehog. He looks great. Everything worked, so we've got a bunch of games on here. And anytime you want to add more ROMs, it's as easy as just take that stick back out, load them into the proper folders, stick it back into there, doing the same thing you did before. Format it to FAT32, put in the RetroPie folder, and then stick it into the Raspberry Pi when it's booted up into RetroPie, and it'll create the new folder structure for you all over again. And when you're done playing, you can, this is one of the points where the hotkey comes in handy, is you can hold down the hotkey, I think, and start, and that should exit out of your game, back to the main menu. When we're done with everything, we can go press start to pull up our main menu and go down to quit and say shut down system, and what that'll do is it'll do a nice clean shutdown so there's no errors the next time we boot up. And there it is. It's powered down. And here we go. Okay. So as I said, it was going to be how to build this whole thing in less than an hour. We did it in about a half an hour or less, even less than a half an hour. And again, we cheated a little bit because we skipped over the steps where we're actually downloading and flashing the card. But those parts of the process really only take about 5-10 minutes tops. I just didn't think you wanted me to be sitting around blabbing at you while we watch the progress bar together. So I spared you that part. Let's do a few frequently asked questions. Since unfortunately, I'm not here to take questions from you live this time around, I want to go through some of the typical kinds of questions that people might ask. Number one, most common question, where do you get ROMs? Unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you that. I can't tell you that. The whole legality of ROMs is a very fuzzy type of issue. Now, one thing that is potentially something you can do, I will get into very briefly, is that you can make your own ROMs. If you actually have cartridges, there are devices that can read those cartridges and dump them to ROMs, and you can actually buy them. There's something called the Retro 2. There's something called the Kazaa, and they are literally devices that you just plug your actual cartridge, your original NES cartridge or your Genesis cartridge or your Super NES cartridge into, and it dumps it and creates the ROM file for you. Even that is questionable as far as the legality goes. I don't think Nintendo loves you to do that, but it's at least less of a gray area than the other means of getting ROMs, which I'm not going to talk about. Other questions. Controllers. So, I did briefly talk about the controllers. You can use just about any kind of USB controller you want. It doesn't matter how many buttons it has. As we talked about in the setup process, if you're using just a classic NES controller because you just really want to play NES games and all it's got is BA select start and the D-pad, no big deal. Like during the setup process, it's going to ask you to configure all kinds of buttons, but that is set up to accommodate the controllers that have at the most buttons possible. When you first plug it in, the system doesn't know how many buttons your controller has, and you can just skip setting up all those buttons. Just keep hitting down or B or whatever it is you want to hit, and skip all the way to the end. And if all you're playing is NES games, it doesn't matter. Like the NES controller is great. It doesn't matter that it has that few buttons. So no big deal. You can even actually use the Wiimote. There's a way to use the Wiimote, and that's a lot more advanced level. This is like Raspberry Pi, RetroPie 101, and that's like a 301 or a 401 level course is how to set up the Wiimote. But if you have the model with Bluetooth, it is a thing you can do. You can actually download some extra software and get the Wiimotes working with the Raspberry Pi. So that's pretty cool. Okay, another question often that people have is about cases. Does it matter what kind of case you have? Do you even have to have a case at all? Like the answer is no. You can run this thing without a case. It's not super sensitive. It's a fairly robust little piece of equipment. And, worst case scenario, you somehow screw it up and you break everything and you're out, $25, $35, and you go buy a new one. It's not the most expensive thing ever. It's cheaper than, most of your other options. And they're way more readily available than, say, like the mini NES or the mini Super Nintendo, which were a limited run thing and don't exist anymore, whereas Raspberry Pi, you can always just go out and buy another one. The only time that they're really hard to find is right when they first come out with a new version. It can tend to be kind of hard to find that new version in stock anywhere, but you wait a few months and then they usually show up all over the place. Okay, and the last question I want to address is which system is the best? And obviously the answer is whichever one I feel like playing at the time. Now, I actually sitting around my house, I still have an original NES, a Super NES. I don't actually have my original Genesis anymore, unfortunately, but I do love that system as well. I can't choose a favorite.